Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Eau Rouge podcast, where we've just finished watching the Dutch Grand Prix, where safety cars really did rule the day and caused quite a lot of chaos in the race. So we're going to talk about that today, definitely with Max Verstappen getting his win in his home country, which I think we both predicted, and Chris, and we thought that this was actually going to be quite a processional win for Verstappen, but then it turned out to be a little bit more difficult than we thought it was going to be. But also Mercedes had a very interesting call today, which I really want to get into first. So obviously we've got Verstappen winning the race. We had Russell coming in second. Leclerc managed to get past Lewis Hamilton to finish third. And what we saw was, it all kicked off with that really strange incident with Tsunoda, where he claimed that his tyres were not on correctly. Then the team told him they were, so he carried on, went into the pits. They fiddled around with his seatbelts, which I think there's a reasonable explanation for that. He came out again and said there was still something wrong. Then they retired the car, but then obviously the VSC came out, which caused teams to pit. Basically, Lewis and Max swapped tyres, essentially. And then, of course, we have Bottas stopping on just before the apex of the first corner, really, and causing a full safety car, which, of course, resulted in Russell deciding to switch to the soft tyres, which put him behind Hamilton and therefore behind Verstappen. Therefore, Lewis didn't have that buffer. So let's try and pick that apart, because I've just tried to give a summary there. So I think the biggest thing here was Russell deciding to go on softs, which ultimately meant that Hamilton didn't have that buffer between himself and Verstappen. So I think it certainly was a detriment to Lewis's race, but it meant Russell came second. What are your thoughts on that, Chris?
I think it was George Russell telling everybody that he doesn't intend to be a second driver. It was a selfish thing to do. It was the wrong thing to do for the team. It prevented Lewis from probably winning. But it did serve him very well, and it made a statement that he's not there to meekly sort of sit second or third and hold up traffic so his teammate can go off and win. And I think that's what was important to him today, wasn't it? It was getting out there, and it was showing that he deserves to be the number one. And I suspect if he doesn't start winning next year, Hamilton will be off, and then Russell will have firmly cemented himself in the top dog position. So I don't know, because I wouldn't expect a lot of drivers. You wouldn't expect Leclerc to do that. You certainly wouldn't expect Verstappen to do that. You probably wouldn't expect Alonso to do that. Maybe Norris, but there was a lot of talk about how this was like a terrible move from Russell, but I think it's a move that most of the other drivers, certainly the more successful drivers, would choose to make anyway. I remember the last time I saw Lewis being a second driver buffer for his teammate particularly. So I don't know, I think people are very keen to talk about it because it was the turning point in the race, and it did end up really giving the win back to Verstappen, didn't it? But was it that wrong? Is it something we wouldn't have expected? I don't think it is.
I think what makes it look worse is that Hamilton was in the lead, and even though there was probably about 15 laps to go, which was actually still quite a significant chunk of the race, he was in that prime position, and his tyres were. There was a lot of talk about Mercedes not being able to get their tyres up to temperature, and the hards were definitely working better for them. But obviously, being on the mediums for that stint, they felt that with Russell as that buffer, he would have had the time to get the tyres up to speed, and then would have been able to match Verstappen's pace even on softs. And it looks worse because Lewis was leading. And you would think, in theory, because Russell was still pretty quick, you would think in theory that maybe Russell could have held Verstappen off, and they could have had the 1-2. I think that is what is making it look worse. But actually, realistically, when you look at Verstappen this season, when you look at the pace of that Red Bull, it's likely he probably would have dispatched of Russell fairly quickly, maybe even right at the restart, like he did with Lewis in what actually happened. And so you could argue that maybe Russell did make the right call there for himself. He's still got a really solid second. But then again, would he have maybe finished second with the 1-2? Who knows? I think that Mercedes were in a difficult situation with that, but I could see Lewis's frustration there, because what he's seeing is a race win that slipped away, and he's ended up not even in third. He's come fourth when he had the opportunity, you know, with a quarter of the race to go, to win it.
Yeah, and it's understandable he'd be frustrated, because he'll be looking for anything out of this season as well. He's had his worst season, not quite ever, was it? But it's up there. And he's going to want to win. But to be fair, Russell is much further up in the championship battle. He's only a handful of points behind Perez. And he will seriously be looking at a top 3 championship finish this season. So I just find it hard to blame him for doing what nearly every other decent driver would do.
And you make a good point, actually. I mean, he's less than a race win behind Checo in second in the championship. And if, you know, every place counts there. For Verstappen, if he gets a second or third place, it's not really going to derail his title challenge, is it? But a second place compared to a third place for Russell could be the difference in the World Championship come the end of the season. So there is that level of those fine lines really in the championship between
Perez and Leclerc are actually joint second on 201 points, and Russell has 188. So it's not inconceivable, especially with the increase in Mercedes pace and the decrease in Ferrari pace, plus Checo's inability to finish consistently, that you might see Russell finish second, which is big for how far off the pace they've been most of the season. Russell and Verstappen have been the 2 best drivers this year, I think, by nearly any metric. And yeah, I think when you look at it like that, this decision looks different.
And they very rarely make any mistakes, do they? I mean, that's when Verstappen gets into the lead, you know he's going to stay there. Yes, he's had a spin every now and then, but what great driver hasn't? You just don't feel like he himself is going to make a mistake to cause that issue. Where I get the feeling when Charles Leclerc's in the lead, for example, that there's a mistake in him somewhere. I mean, maybe I'm being a bit harsh because it happened to him in France, but you just feel like there's a mistake in him sort of every now and then, that, you know, if he ever is in the lead and he's maybe in a convincing lead. I know he's won races before, but you always get that feeling. And you're right, I do think that Russell and Verstappen have been the most consistent. I mean, Russell's never finished outside. I know it gets brought up every race, but he's not finished outside the top 5 this season, other than when he's retired, which was once. And that is very consistent, and he plays those numbers, I think, very, very well. And so, yeah, looking at it in that light, you can certainly say that perhaps he made the right decision today. Moving on to Ferrari, I don't know what to say about them today. I'd like to talk about that Sainz pit stop, which happened earlier in the race, because it was really strange. It was quite bizarre, where I think what happened was Sainz made a late call to come into the pits, and they weren't ready for him. But I thought that there was an interesting point made when I was watching it by the commentators, which was that the driver makes a call, and the engineers are the go-between between him and the mechanics. And the engineers have to make that call to say, well, are the mechanics going to be ready if the driver pits now? And clearly they weren't. So there's that breakdown in communication there. Sainz tries to make a quick call. The engineers will say yes or no, depending on the situation in the paddock, and then whatever happens. And today, Sainz goes into the pits and they didn't have the tyres ready, and they were missing a hot one. They were missing 2 whole tyres. He was just sat there on the jacks for ages, just waiting for these tyres to come by. And I got to be honest, I mean, I don't want to criticise the Ferrari mechanics too much, but to me, they didn't look particularly rushed. And then one of them had left the wheel gun lying around quite far outside the pit box, which Checo then ran over. And it is a very tight pit lane in Zandvoort, really, really tight. And Checo ran over it. It was a bit of a non-incident, but actually, again, for me, I think it highlights Ferrari's incompetence. And then later in the race, Sainz gets a 5-second penalty for an unsafe release. Again, his team just really not with him today, and it's cost him.
Yeah, we said it last week. What is going on? How can Ferrari be so famous and successful and like attract so many great drivers, but not be able to have a vaguely competent pit crew, a vaguely competent strategy team, vaguely competent engineers? Like, it's almost like they're trying to lose it, which obviously they're not, but it's just really, they're only 30 points ahead of Mercedes in the constructors title now. And they had the best car at the start of the year. They had a really good car. And yeah, really, like, I don't think Ferrari are going to finish second. I think they're going to slip to third. And Mercedes are going to carry on their upward trend, and they're going to have the better of the two finishes, and they're going to steal second place in the title battle. And then everyone's going to look back on this season as the season of Verstappen dominance, where Mercedes just didn't have it together in time. And they're going to completely forget about the start of the season, where it looked like Leclerc was nailed on for a championship.
And Leclerc didn't look particularly convincing today either, did he, really? I mean, I think he got a bit lucky to come third. Hamilton's tyres just weren't there for him at the end of the race. He won soft, really. And so if Leclerc keeps picking up those kinds of results towards the end of the season, then he'll be fine. He had a season, but like you said, it's framing it from the beginning of the season, when you've got a driver like Leclerc who has the talent and then has the car underneath him to actually win races. And then suddenly you're thinking, well, okay, we've got a title fight. We have something here, and Mercedes aren't there, so we've got a title fight. And then as the season goes on, you just start to see how it's almost like it's this kind of masochism that Ferrari have, where they just seem to love hurting themselves, shooting themselves in the foot constantly, and I get some kind of pleasure from it. And it's such a shame, because I know this has no bearing on anything, but it's such a beautiful looking car, the Ferrari, this season. It's so nice. And you want to, in the future, you want to look back at those stunning cars and think, not only did it look good, like the performance matched the beauty, or the beauty matched the performance, whatever. And you want to look back and think, that was a legendary car. And Ferrari are themselves going against that. They are turning it into this what might have been season.
Yeah, no, and it's a shame that this is how it's all ended, because it's over. Like, it is over. No one's getting near Verstappen now. I see people speculating online that the Sonoda thing was all an elaborate ruse by Helmut Marko to get a safety car. But I can't imagine why he'd feel the need to do that, given how far it is. He's over 100 points clear in the title battle. Like, who's catching him at this point? Nobody. Not with this few races left. And the fact that the Red Bull is the best driver and the best car combination there. So it's over, and it shouldn't be over. It should, maybe not as tight as last year, but it should still be a real close battle.
So I want to talk about the Dutch fans for a little bit, because obviously they come into light when it's their home Grand Prix, and obviously when we talk about the Dutch fans, that is a huge population of people. So I suppose there's a little bit of generalization going on here, but we did see some flares causing some issues, especially in qualifying. Thankfully, there wasn't any issues today in the race. But there was a flare that caused a red flag. I think it was at the beginning of Q2 yesterday, and then also during Q3 as well, although it didn't end up on the track, but it was sort of thrown towards it. And now, I mean, these flares are outright banned, but they're still getting through the security checks at the entrances. So we've got this issue now, which wasn't really anything that we suspected, I don't think, maybe a few years ago, or something that we expected to happen. Even with the diehard fans like the Tifosi, or for example, we've not really seen this kind of fan before. Is it worrying, or is it something that it's happening now and it's going to die out relatively soon in terms of the flares?
I think it will get stamped on, won't it? I think that with the success of Verstappen, there's a huge influx of new fans into the sport, bringing traditions from other European sporting events with them. And it's been highlighted this time as a big issue. And you had the guy who the flare in qualifying, who was kicked out by the fans and arrested for several hours. And I think there'll probably be another flare incident next year, and then it'll just be like everyone gets searched for flares in European races. And that'll probably just be the end of it. If they can do it at football, they can certainly do it at Formula One, I think.
And I want to try and avoid the trite nature of this conversation, because obviously everybody's saying how it's ruining the race, or it's ruining the race weekend, and it does, and there's no denying that. I don't think any reasonable F1 fan wants to see anything thrown on the track, and they don't care for the flares. Like, you know, for me, when I watch the race, it doesn't really add to the atmosphere. It's the large crowds of people watching the Formula One that adds to the atmosphere. A flare doesn't do anything for me. But also, I think that maybe it is something just to pick up on, in terms of that it's something that we've not seen in Formula One before, and it's not something that maybe we're quite used to. And actually, if you're starting to get these fans where they're getting searched before races and stuff, again, which is not unusual at any large sporting event, absolutely not, but could it pave the way for something else? Is there a domino effect that might happen here, where, you know, there's more worrying issues that might arise from it later down the line?
I think I mean, it could happen, couldn't it? But I think that probably it will be controlled before that becomes a big issue. I'm sure there are possible scenarios where someone throws a flare, there's a huge collision in the smoke, and someone's seriously injured. But I suspect probably that this Grand Prix marks the turning point in the way that F1 starts policing crowds, which apparently needs to happen, because there's been a few incidences over the last couple of years now where, not crowd trouble, but there have certainly been incidences in the crowd. And looking at managing increasing numbers is going to have to be something the sport does. But I'm sure that is a priority, especially after this season. It'll be something that they take very seriously in the off period. And yeah, I don't know, it could be an issue, but I don't think it will be an issue, if you see what I mean. A bit like when you had all the problems with crowds so close to the track back in the 60s and 70s, and then it became an issue, they addressed the issue, and now, outside of very occasional unfortunate incidents, it's absolutely fine.
Because this is what we don't want to see as well, is it? Is that crowds, especially at a place like Zandvoort, where having the crowd very close to the track is, well, part of the atmosphere, but also it's inevitable because it's such a tight and twisting circuit, and it's, you know, it weaves in and out of sand dunes basically. But we don't want to see these now, like, large fences coming up, even larger fences, you know, because I think many fans understand the fences are there obviously to protect them. I mean, and you look at the crash that Zhou had at Silverstone, where, you know, he could have ended up in the crowd if it wasn't for the catch fence. We all understand why they're there, but what we don't want is just to see crowds reversing further and further back, or fences going higher and higher so nobody can actually throw objects. Because at the moment we are lucky enough for it to be safe enough where we don't have to have fences that are that high, where we can actually have an unobstructed view of the track. And so that's obviously what we want to avoid. But also, I mean, if you're a fan and you pay to get in, I mean, I'm assuming these fans who bring flares in are paying fans. I don't see why, you know, they necessarily wouldn't be, considering the sheer number of them. And you get in just to waste all your money like that. Like the amount it costs to go and watch Formula One Grand Prix over a weekend. And also, if you throw it in quali, so you don't even get to see the race, it's just mental, and it just doesn't make any sense. But I know that's a cliche. We've all been saying that. We know that is that. But it just doesn't make any sense, does it?
Well, yeah, but I think it's easy to get carried away, isn't it, in the heat of a sporting event. And a flare seems like, I mean, flare people really like flares, especially in football.
Flare people really like flares.
A flare people thing, isn't it? But yeah, no, I think the crowd things with large groups of over enthusiastic fans will be a thing of the past probably very soon, and you'll still have lots of fans, but it'll be a much more sanitized experience like the Premier League rather than a wilder, flare-toting, dubiously chanting mob as it is currently.
And the last point I want to make for the pod today, or the last thing I'd like to talk about, is it was confirmed during the week that Piastri will be going to McLaren next year. There's been a lot of rumours around the Alpine seat, and we still don't really know who that's going to be yet. But obviously there was the issue for the contract with Piastri, for the Alpine and Piastri contract, and then the contract for Piastri and McLaren went to the Court of Arbitration, and they ruled in McLaren's favour. It really looks like Alpine dropped the ball on this one. They didn't seem to have him tied down very well at all, which meant that he was free to negotiate his contract. But also, I think Alpine have got quite a lot of strong options for the seat, for the spare seat that they've got.
Yeah, I mean, these are two separate things. I think one conversation is about how Alpine assumed there were so few available seats in F1, you can put a driver on the back burner indefinitely with promises of getting a race seat eventually, and they'll just accept it because it's so hard to get in. Whereas some drivers are more proactively trying to find seats now, hence Piastri's shopping around. And then when Alonso suddenly announced his move to Aston Martin, they were caught out because Piastri had been negotiating elsewhere and hadn't told them. They hadn't really looked after Piastri properly, so he felt the need to look elsewhere. And you had this entire situation. But as for the moves, it seems like Gasly to Alpine, Herta to AlphaTauri, and then is there a seat for Daniel Ricciardo at Williams, who will probably get rid of Latifi, or Haas, who are rumoured to be getting rid of Schumacher? Maybe, but would I go there if I was Ricciardo? Or would I go to America and do something I'd rather do, rather than just be getting into Q2 on a good day? Which is what he's doing currently in McLaren. So doing that in a Williams, I think, will be even harder. And he's never had to really contend with a bad car. He's had a few not great cars, but he's never had a real absolute dog of a car that doesn't have much performance in it and you really need to wring the neck of. So would it just be easier for him to move to NASCAR? There's a few F1 drivers there at the moment. That could be interesting. Does he want to go across to Indy? Does he want to do something entirely different? I don't know. I suppose he doesn't know entirely. I'm sure he's determined to stay in Formula One, but it sounds like he's not the first choice for Alpine. I can't imagine why he'd go to AlphaTauri, given that he left the senior Red Bull team. And I don't know that it's worth his while going to a back marker. So is this the end for Daniel Ricciardo in Formula One, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we spoke about it a lot last week. I think Ricciardo's only option is Williams to stay in F1. And yeah, if I was Ricciardo, I'm not sure that's what I'd want. It depends how dedicated you are to the sport. Albon is really starting to get to grips with that Williams, which is nice to see. I'm not sure if you can call it progress for the team. When Russell was driving for Williams, I think we had this hope that they were making progress and that they might become a midfield challenger. And really, that's not happened, and I can't really see it happening either for some time. And so he will be confined to the back if Ricciardo does take that Williams seat. So yeah, for me, I don't think so. In regards to the other moves as well, I think for Alpine, I think it is a no-brainer to go for Pierre Gasly. You'll have two French drivers for your French team. Gasly's looking for a team to start progressing. The AlphaTauri is not as good this season as it was last season, and it's always going to be a midfield team or a midfield to back of the grid team, depending on how their season goes. They're never going to be, pushing any further than that. Alpine are having a good season, and if they can maintain that, if they can keep that going, and the momentum, then they could well progress And I think it's the move Gasly's looking for. I think it's the one he's needed. I think I said it a lot last season, where he needs to get out of that AlphaTauri team if he's going to improve, because he's not. I don't think he's going to get that second Red Bull racing seat, even when Checo's contract does eventually run out. He is getting older. I mean, he's not old, but he's getting older. You know, his career is entering the second. He's entering the second half of his career, basically, isn't he? Where in theory he's going to start peaking, and so that's when you need to be in a team that is at least top 4 or 5 material. And so I think for Alpine and for Gasly, it's a no-brainer. I think they should go for that. I'm a little concerned for Schumacher, though. Really not sure where he's going. If Haas is going, if Haas are going to drop him, then his only other option, by the looks of things, will be AlphaTauri if Gasly moves.
But AlphaTauri have already said they're not interested in a Ferrari Academy driver, and they don't see the value in signing him. So I can't see.
So we can't see that
this
happening.
news that they're trying desperately to get Colton Herta a super license, which makes a lot more sense. I think Schumacher's marketing power is probably relatively less than having an American driver in a country where F1 is expanding massively and has 3 races.
Yeah, and so I'm concerned for him. I mean, it's not necessarily confirmed yet, is it, that Haas to dropping him? So there's still potential that he could be retained maybe for next season. But there was that thing about the Ferrari Academy, wasn't there? How he was supposedly leading the Ferrari Academy.
Well, whether that was down to him or whether that was down to Ferrari doesn't really matter, I suppose. Has he seen that it's a shambles and he'd be better off looking elsewhere? Or have they decided that actually 2-point scoring finishes in 2 years and really just a lot of back of the grid finishes are not good enough, which I'd maybe argue is the case. But if his name wasn't Schumacher, would we really be having this conversation? Would we be devoting the last couple of minutes of our podcast to discussing? We haven't talked about Latifi once, who's been in F1 just as long, if not longer, and is a title sponsor for the team that is sacking him. So is it a big issue that he is being let go potentially both by his academy and by his team? I don't think so. He'll still find some success. His name is still Schumacher, and I suppose he might get to come back, but I'm dubious. He got lucky when he won Formula 2, to be fair. He only had 2 wins that season. He's not really, looking at his lower league pedigree, a natural born winner, perhaps in the same way that his father was. And if you put him in a faster car, would he have a career as respectable as his uncle? Possibly. But F1's so competitive and tight now, I'm not sure that's good enough to cut it in the modern era. I think with so many good drivers, Nick de Vries is still without a drive. You've got Herta they want to get in. Giovinazzi rumoured to be taking his place, a driver who I do think actually was better than Schumacher. And Ricciardo without a seat. You know, Perez probably out of contract at the end of next year. There are so many good names in the sport. Is there room for somebody whose name is nearly Michael Schumacher to trundle around in about 15th place? Or is it time to open up those slots to drivers who might do a bit more with it?
It's a big argument. I think it's one that I have to say I'm probably inclined to agree with you on that. Well, that brings us to the end. Thank you so much, everybody who is listening. Please do like and subscribe. We're really happy to be back. I love talking about Formula One, and so that's what we're doing. We're just trying to enjoy ourselves, and obviously anyone who's listening, we want you to enjoy yourselves too. Please leave a comment. If there is any comments that come up, we'll definitely discuss them in the pod for our next race. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.